Margaret had always been a creature of habit. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, she made the short walk from her little house on the outskirts of Charleston to her son Daniel's jewelry store in the heart of the city. It wasn't just a visit, it was a ritual. Something that gave her life a rhythm she had come to rely on in her later years. Margaret was well into her late 70s, but in many ways, she still felt the tug of the world around her. Her son Daniel had inherited the store from his late father, and it had become a cornerstone of their small family. The quaint little shop, tucked away on a cobblestone street, offered a variety of high-end jewelry. But it was more than just a business to Margaret, it was a place of connection. When she entered the store, she didn't just see the gleaming gold and sparkling gems, she saw Daniel, her only child, at the heart of it all. She loved watching him interact with customers, his face lighting up with each transaction, his calm voice guiding people toward the right pieces. To her, Daniel wasn't just her son, he was a man who had worked hard to build something of value, to carry on the legacy of his father, and she was proud of him beyond words. This particular Tuesday, Margaret had packed her usual lunch for him, a small basket filled with a sandwich, some fresh fruit, and a flask of homemade iced tea. She didn't want him to go hungry, especially during the busy hours when he barely had time for a break. The store had always been bustling, especially now with the tourists flocking to Charleston for the warmer months. It was a testament to Daniel's work ethic and charm that the shop had not only survived but thrived in an industry that could be so fickle. Margaret had come to enjoy these moments of solitude in the store, strolling among the gleaming displays as she waited for her son to finish with his customers. Today, she was lost in thought, her eyes scanning the delicate pieces in the display case in front of her. There was something particularly beautiful about this pair of diamond earrings. As she leaned in to get a closer look, she couldn't help but be reminded of a pair she had once owned. They had been a gift from Daniel's father, on the occasion of their 25th wedding anniversary. The diamonds were not particularly large, but they were perfect, delicate and timeless, just like their love. She remembered how, on their anniversary, Daniel had been just a boy, excited for his parents' celebration. She could still hear his voice, full of innocence, asking her why the earrings were so special. Margaret had explained that the diamonds were more than just stones, they represented years of shared moments, of laughter, tears, of growing old together. The earrings had been a symbol of all the love they had given each other over the years. But that was years ago, before the silence had come to their home, before the long months of illness had taken her husband away. As Margaret continued to admire the earrings, her fingers lightly brushing against the glass of the display case, she felt a pang of sadness. Time, she knew, had a way of slipping away unnoticed. Her husband was gone, and Daniel was now a grown man with a business to run. Margaret's role in his life had shifted, and though she had always been proud of him, there was a quiet longing in her heart for the days when he was her little boy. The days when their world felt whole. Her reverie was interrupted when she accidentally brushed against the display case. One of the earrings, delicate as it was, wobbled on its stand and tumbled to the floor. Margaret gasped, her heart racing as she bent down to pick it up. She hadn't meant to cause any harm. She had only been admiring the piece, lost in her memories. As her fingers touched the earring, she felt a warmth in her chest. But the peace of the moment was short-lived. From the corner of her eye, Margaret noticed a young woman approaching. She was new. Margaret realized Miss Turner, the new saleswoman who had started working at the shop just a few weeks ago. Margaret had yet to speak with her properly, but she had heard Daniel mention that she was eager, hardworking, and had a sharp eye for detail. Yet, as Miss Turner's gaze landed on the fallen earring, something in her posture shifted. There was a coldness in the way she looked at Margaret. A shift that Margaret couldn't quite place. Before Margaret could explain, Miss Turner's voice cut through the air. "You were trying to steal that, weren't you?" she said, her words sharp and accusatory. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. What? No. She stammered, trying to collect herself. But Miss Turner was already taking a step back, her eyes wide with suspicion. You knocked it off the stand. Who else would do that? If not someone trying to take it. Miss Turner's voice was firm, but there was something cruel in the way she spoke. Margaret felt a wave of panic rise within her, an overwhelming sense of disbelief. I wasn't trying to steal it, Margaret said, her voice trembling. I was admiring it. I didn't mean to. But Miss Turner had already turned away. Her eyes darted toward the door. Margaret, still holding the earring in her hand, could feel the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy blanket. She knew that this was the beginning of something terrible, but she couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. Before she could speak again, Miss Turner was on the phone, calling the police. Margaret stood there, still holding the diamond earring in her hand, feeling as though time had stopped. The warmth that had once filled her chest, the soft memories of her late husband, was now replaced by a chilling coldness. Her fingers tightened around the earring as Miss Turner's words echoed in her mind. You were trying to steal that, weren't you? Margaret's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had never stolen anything in her life, not a single thing. She had raised Daniel with the values of honesty and kindness. And now she was being accused of something so foreign, so hurtful. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. But nothing seemed to fit. She was just a mother, a grandmother, a woman in her twilight years who had come to the store to visit her son, to bring him lunch and maybe share a quiet moment together. How had it all gone so terribly wrong? But Miss Turner, who was now speaking in a hushed tone on the phone, seemed deaf to her pleas. Margaret could feel the heat rising in her face. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. She opened her mouth to speak again, to try to explain. But her words faltered. It didn't matter what she said. The accusation was already out there, and the younger woman's suspicion had hardened into something much more dangerous. I need you to stay where you are, a voice suddenly interrupted. Cold and commanding. Margaret looked up to see two uniformed police officers standing in the doorway of the store. They must have arrived moments ago. Yet it felt like they had been there for hours, watching her every move with judgmental eyes. The silence in the store felt suffocating. Are you arresting me? Margaret asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Why had they come so quickly? Why hadn't they even asked her side of the story? Step away from the display case, one of the officers barked. He was tall, with short cropped hair and a stern expression that gave no hint of empathy. His partner, a younger man with soft eyes, seemed uncomfortable. But he didn't speak. Margaret's hands shook as she reluctantly placed the earring back on the counter and stepped away from the display. Her mind was racing, but the words she needed to defend herself seemed to vanish into thin air. I'm going to have to ask you to turn around, the officer continued. Margaret felt her legs weaken beneath her as the officer reached for his handcuffs. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. It was as if the world around her had been turned into a blur of motion, and she was trapped in some surreal nightmare. The older officer roughly grabbed her arm, pulling it behind her back. She winced in pain, the sharp pressure of the cuffs biting into her wrists. Her breath quickened, her chest tightening with each breath. The store, the beautiful jewelry, the peaceful afternoons spent with her son, it all seemed so distant now. In its place was a sense of helplessness, a crushing awareness that no matter what she said, no one would listen. Mom! A familiar voice broke through the haze of confusion. Margaret turned her head, her heart leaping at the sound of her son's name. It was Daniel, standing in the doorway, his face pale with shock and anger. His eyes flicked from the officers to Margaret, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. He had just come back from a meeting with a supplier, unaware of the storm that had been brewing in his absence. Mom! What's going on? What are you doing to her? Daniel's voice was low, but there was a tremor of desperation in it. He moved toward Margaret, but the officers blocked his path. Sir, you need to step back, the younger officer said, his tone firm but less hostile than his partner's. She didn't do anything wrong, Daniel said, his voice rising. What is this? Why are you arresting her? Mom, what happened? Margaret could see the confusion in Daniel's eyes. The hurt. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't find a way to make him understand what was happening. How could she explain the terror and humiliation she was feeling? When even the officers seemed intent on believing the worst of her, one of the officers turned to Miss Turner, who had been watching the scene unfold with cold detachment. Is this the woman who caused the disturbance? He asked. Yes, Miss Turner said, her voice still laced with accusation. She knocked over the earring. And when I confronted her, she tried to steal it. I'm just doing my job. Margaret's heart sank as Miss Turner spoke. Her voice had no remorse, no hint of doubt. It was as if she truly believed Margaret was guilty. How could someone so young, so eager to prove herself, be so quick to judge? Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. His eyes darted from his mother to the officers, then back to Miss Turner. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mother was fragile, both in body and in spirit, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing her treated this way. Mom, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm going to get you out of this. Don't worry. I'll fix it. But Margaret knew, in that moment, that nothing would be the same again. The pain of this moment, the humiliation, the helplessness, would stay with her forever. She looked at her son, her heart breaking for him. This wasn't just an injustice against her, it was an injustice against him, too. The officers began to lead Margaret toward the door, her feet dragging beneath her. Daniel was still standing there, helpless and angry, watching as his mother was taken away. As the door of the jewelry store swung open and Margaret was led out, Daniel stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming for action. He had always been the protector, the one who had promised his mother that he would never let anything bad happen to her. And yet here she was, handcuffed and led away by officers, a victim of something so unjust, so inexplicable. Without thinking, Daniel rushed forward, his voice shaking with anger. Stop. Let her go, he shouted, his words echoing in the otherwise quiet street. But the officers didn't stop. They kept moving, their grip on Margaret tightening, ignoring Daniel's protests. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't fathom how things had escalated so quickly. One moment, his mother had been admiring a piece of jewelry, lost in her memories, and now she was being dragged away like a common criminal. His breath caught in his throat as he watched the older officer, whose eyes were steely and unfeeling. Daniel had always respected the police, but now, in this moment, he saw them in a different light, agents of power, wielding it without care, without understanding. Please, Daniel called, his voice desperate. She didn't do anything wrong. You've got to believe me, she's my mother. The younger officer hesitated, glancing briefly at his partner. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But he didn't speak. It wasn't enough. The officers continued to move toward the squad car, indifferent to the scene they were causing. Daniel's anger began to boil over. His hands clenched into fists. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not to his mother. Not to anyone. Excuse me, he shouted, pushing his way past the officers and standing in front of them, blocking their path. You're making a huge mistake. I demand to speak with the chief. Right now. The older officer finally looked at Daniel, his eyes narrowing. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. Daniel stood firm, his voice rising. I'm not going anywhere until you release her. This is a mistake. And you know it. My mother is a law-abiding citizen. She doesn't deserve this. Margaret, still in handcuffs, glanced up at her son, her heart aching with love and guilt. She had never wanted to cause him trouble. The tears that threatened to spill from her eyes were not just from the pain of the arrest, but from the fear of seeing Daniel so upset, so powerless. She had always tried to shield him from the hardships of life. But now, in this moment, she realized how much he had carried on his shoulders. He had grown into a man who would fight for what was right. And she could see that in his eyes now. The older officer seemed to weigh his options. After a moment of tense silence, he spoke. Fine. We'll hold off on the arrest for now. But you'll have to come down to the station to file a report. Daniel nodded, his mind still racing with anger. That's more than fair, he said through gritted teeth. But you'll also be hearing from my lawyer. This will not stand. With that, the officers reluctantly uncuffed Margaret, allowing her to stand. Her wrists sore from the tight metal. She winced, rubbing them gently as Daniel turned to her, his face full of concern. Are you okay, Mom? He asked softly, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Margaret nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Daniel could not ignore. This wasn't just about the arrest. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be erased by a few apologies. I'm fine, Daniel, she said, her voice shaky. But this isn't right. I don't understand how it could happen. I don't either, Daniel replied, his voice firm. But we're going to fix this. I won't let them get away with it. As they stood in front of the jewelry store, the once bustling city street felt strangely quiet. The world seemed to pause for a moment, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel held his mother close, his arms wrapped around her protectively, his anger giving way to determination. Later that day, Daniel would go to the police station, demanding answers. He would file a complaint, not just for the false accusation, but for the way his mother had been treated brutally, unfairly, without a moment's hesitation. It was a fight he wasn't prepared to lose. Over the next few days, the incident became the talk of the town. News outlets picked up the story, and the community was divided. Some sided with Daniel, condemning the officers and the young saleswoman for their actions, while others argued that the police had simply been doing their job. But for Daniel and Margaret, the fight wasn't about public opinion. It was about something deeper, a sense of justice, of what was right and wrong, and the responsibility they both had to stand up against discrimination. No matter where it came from, Miss Turner would eventually face legal consequences for her false accusation and for the emotional distress she had caused Margaret. The officers, too, would be held accountable for their actions, with a public apology issued by the department. But for Daniel and Margaret, the aftermath of this ordeal was far from over. The scars, both physical and emotional, would linger. But they were determined to use this experience to spark a broader conversation about prejudice and accountability in their community. What had started as a quiet visit to the store had become a defining moment in both their lives. And though it had been painful, it had also shown them the power of love, empathy, and the importance of standing up for what was right. In the days that followed the incident, as the dust began to settle and the noise of public debate faded into the background, each of the key players in this story, Margaret, Daniel, and even Miss Turner, was forced to reckon with their own actions, and to reflect on the lessons they had learned from the events that had transpired. Sitting in her favorite chair, the one by the window where the sunlight always seemed to warm her old bones, Margaret thought long and hard about everything that had happened. The days had been difficult, filled with emotions she hadn't expected to feel at her age: shame, fear, anger. But as the days wore on, and as she spent more time with Daniel, she began to see the situation from a different perspective. The arrest, the humiliation, the coldness of the officers and Miss Turner, these were all painful memories. But Margaret knew now that it wasn't those moments that defined her. What mattered was how she responded. In the face of injustice, she hadn't allowed herself to crumble. She had stood tall, even when her legs had trembled. And Daniel, her son, had been there every step of the way, never questioning her, never leaving her side. Through this experience, Margaret learned something crucial: never let others define your worth. People might misjudge you. They might humiliate you. But that doesn't take away who you are. Her life, her values, her integrity, none of that had changed. No matter what Miss Turner or the officers thought. Margaret understood now that injustice is inevitable. But how we rise above it is what truly matters. Her hands, once trembling in fear, now steadied as she reached for the knitting she had abandoned weeks ago. Margaret smiled, remembering the words her mother had once told her: "The storm may shake you, but you decide whether to let it break you." It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. For Daniel, the ordeal had been nothing short of a wake-up call. At first, he had been consumed by his anger at the police officers, at Miss Turner, at the world. He had felt an overwhelming desire to fix the situation, to make everything right, to shield his mother from the harshness of the world. But as the days went by, and as he sat with Margaret, watching her slowly heal from the trauma, Daniel began to realize that the true challenge wasn't just confronting the injustice, it was confronting his own assumptions. The world he had known, one where fairness always prevailed, had shattered that day. And that was a tough pill to swallow. He had always believed that doing the right thing meant standing up against wrongdoers. But what he learned through this experience was something deeper. True justice requires us to acknowledge our own biases and imperfections first. The world was not as black and white as he had once thought. His initial anger toward the police officers had been a reaction. But now he saw how much of that anger had been fueled by his own fear of losing his mother, fear of being powerless. He understood now that fighting for justice meant being open to uncomfortable truths. About others. And about himself. His mother's strength in the face of adversity had been a profound lesson to him. Sometimes, standing up for what's right doesn't mean winning, it means showing up, speaking out, and doing your part to make the world a little more just. That's what Daniel had done, and that's what he would continue to do. For his mother. For his community. And for himself. For Miss Turner. The events that unfolded were nothing less than a turning point in her life. She had been so focused on proving herself in her new job, eager to show that she was capable and competent, that she had made one fateful mistake: she had let her assumptions cloud her judgment. At first, she couldn't fathom the idea that she could be wrong. She was just following procedure, after all. But as the truth of the situation emerged through the complaints, the public outcry, and even the words of her colleagues, Miss Turner began to realize the gravity of her actions. She had judged Margaret without giving her the benefit of the doubt, without pausing to understand the situation. In doing so, she had caused harm that couldn't simply be undone with an apology. Miss Turner's lesson was a hard one: be slow to judge, quick to listen, and always be willing to reflect on your actions. People are complex, and situations are rarely as simple as they seem at first glance. She realized now that she had been so eager to maintain control, so desperate to prove her worth, that she had overlooked the most basic tenet of empathy: seeing others as human beings, not just as problems to be solved. As she sat alone in her apartment one evening, Miss Turner made a silent vow to herself: she would change. She would listen more. She would learn more. She would be more kind. And, most importantly, she would remember Margaret's face every time she was tempted to make a quick judgment in the future. The events surrounding Margaret's arrest had ripple effects that spread far beyond the jewelry store. In the days and weeks that followed, the town of Portland found itself grappling with difficult conversations about prejudice, power, and accountability. The story of one woman's arrest had become a symbol of something larger, a moment for the community to reflect on its values, its assumptions, and its commitment to fairness. What began as a painful and traumatic experience for one family had sparked something profound. The community came together, holding public forums, engaging in difficult conversations, and, in many cases, confronting uncomfortable truths about their own biases. While the discussions were not easy, they were necessary, and the impact of those conversations would continue to shape the town's collective conscience for years to come. As the final chapter of this story unfolded, Margaret, Daniel, and Miss Turner had all emerged changed not just by the events themselves, but by the lessons they had learned. Through suffering, through pain, and through reflection, each of them had come to understand something vital, that we are all capable of change, capable of growth, and that, even in the most difficult of circumstances, we have the power to choose how we respond. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all.